In the spring of 1846, two families, the Donner and Reed clans, decided to leave their comfortable lives in Illinois and start anew in the West. They had heard tales of a vast valley of plenty in California, and they dreamed of owning vast tracts of fertile land and enjoying a life of peace and prosperity. With the addition of several other families who shared their dreams, the group formed the core of what would become known as the Donner Party. Altogether, there were 87 people in all, including children and servants. They were a mix of farmers, shopkeepers, and businessmen, all seeking a better future for themselves and their children. They believed that with their combined resources, they could easily make the arduous journey across the continent and establish a new life for themselves in the far west. They assembled a massive convoy, 21 wagons piled high with supplies and livestock, enough, they believed, to sustain them through the journey and ensure their future in California. But what the party didn't know was that their dream of a new life was about to turn into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. As the group traveled west, their leader, George Donner, decided to take a shortcut through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Despite warnings of heavy snow and impassable terrain, Donner was confident that his group could make it. But soon they found themselves trapped by a brutal early winter in the high mountains. As the snow fell and temperatures plummeted, their supplies began to dwindle. The group was forced to kill their oxen and eat their hides, then abandon their wagons and trek through the snow on foot. The journey that should have taken months had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Within weeks, the party was starving and freezing. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing what little food they had left. Hope began to fade as the cold seeped into their bones. Then came the fateful night when their cabin was broken into and their meager food stores were stolen by a group of Native Americans. In desperation, the pioneers were forced to do the unthinkable. They resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. George and his son-in-law, Louis Keseberg, were the first to succumb to the dark necessity. After George's death, his body stayed in the cabin, and over time, it became a grim buffet for the starving party members. One survivor later recounted the gruesome details, describing how the meat was cut off the bones with a saw and how the brain was considered a special treat. Children were spared this grim fate, but only because there wasn't much meat on their bones. The desperate parents watched helplessly as their children wasted away, knowing that soon they too would be forced to resort to the ultimate taboo. Meanwhile, outside the camp, a rescue party was searching for survivors. But they were too late. Of the 87 people who had set out from Illinois, only 48 would live to tell the tale. Many had died from starvation and exposure, while others perished in the desperate struggle for survival. Those who did survive were forever marked by the horrors they had endured. The Donner Party's story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, but also to the lengths to which people will go to survive. Their ordeal serves as a reminder of the fragility of civilization and the darkness that can consume us when all hope seems lost. It's a story that has echoed through American history, a cautionary tale of a dream that turned into a nightmare. The Donner Party's legacy continues to fascinate and horrify us, a stark reminder of the human cost of westward expansion and the terrible price of survival. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like and share for more historical tales. And then tragedy struck. At the very same moment, Reed and the other members of the Donner Party were reading Hastings' book. Word arrived in California that the Mexican government had declared all further immigration illegal. Though the travelers didn't know it, a political firestorm was brewing over the U.S. government's right to annex California. This wasn't going to be an easy land grab. Now, panicked, Reed decided to press on. The cutoff was fraught with peril, but at least it might get them to California before the U.S. government stepped in. The Donner Party split into two, with Reed leading the way. The rest would follow later. And so, guided by James Reed and fueled by the dream of gold, our story truly begins. It's me. Welcome to the California Trail, a new series about the epic journeys across the American West. Before there were paved roads or even cars, there were trails. And one of the most epic stories ever to come out of those trails is the Donner Party. The year was 1846, and the place was the Great Basin Desert. A group of immigrants looking for gold in California accidentally found themselves lost in one of the harshest environments on Earth. What followed was one of the most harrowing tales of survival against all odds. But let's start at the beginning. The Donner Party was actually just one part of a larger wave of migration moving west. Since the 1830s, thousands of Americans had been pouring into Oregon and California. seeking new lives amid the wild frontier of the Pacific Northwest. These immigrants became known as the 49ers because most of them began their journeys in 1849, following rumors of gold that had been discovered at Sutter's Mill in Northern California. In 1846, however, when our story begins, this gold rush was still 3 years away. During the 1830s, most immigrants traveled to Oregon, driven by the belief that it would soon become a U.S. territory. But in 1845, the British and Americans signed the Oregon Treaty, establishing the border between British Canada and U.S. territory at the 49th parallel, leaving California as the only viable option for those seeking land and adventure. Now, California was still part of Mexico, but that didn't deter most immigrants, many of whom believed that the United States would soon annex the territory. Despite its promise of fertile lands and pleasant weather, California was actually pretty hard to get to. The nearest seaport was more than 2,000 miles away, and most immigrants traveled on foot or by horse. But the California Trail was the most established and safest route. It stretched from the Missouri River to the Sierra Nevada mountains, where immigrants could finally catch a glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. Most travelers took about 4 to 6 months to cover the 2,000-mile journey, though some made it in as little as 80 days. When the Donner Party set out in 1846, they had no idea that they would end up being trapped in the desert. To their knowledge, they were following the well-worn path to California, but they soon discovered that this was not going to be a typical trip. In a few weeks, they would find themselves lost in the Great Salt Lake Desert, thanks to one man, Lansford Hastings. Born in Connecticut in 1816, Hastings dreamed of exploring the American frontier. He published a book detailing his travels through the Rocky Mountains and Oregon. And then in 1846, he published another book about a new route to California. His guide promised a shorter, easier route to the Willamette Valley, but the shortcut would lead his readers straight into the Great Salt Lake Desert, a flat, sandy area covering much of northern Utah and southern Oregon. In Chapter 1, we saw how James Reed discovered Hastings' book while the Donner Party was stopped at Fort Laramie. Impatient to reach California, Reed decided to trust Hastings' claims and take the shortcut. With half the party, they veered off the established trail, but almost immediately, their wagons began getting stuck in the sand. Within a few days, they realized that Hastings had lied. They were hopelessly lost in a sea of sand. But help was on the way. Next time on the California Trail. Hi, I'm the host. And next time on the California Trail, the Donner Party gets even more desperate as they struggle to free themselves from the sands of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Will they make it out alive? Find out next time. Part 2, The Fatal Shortcut. At the end of July, the Donner Party reached a critical fork in the road. The established trail went northwest. It was a safe but longer journey. The new trail, the Hastings Cutoff, went southwest into the unknown. Most of the wagon trains at the river crossing stuck to the old path. But the leaders of the Donner Party, swayed by the promise of a faster journey, decided to risk it. A seasoned mountain man and friend of James Reed, James Kleiman, had just come east through the cutoff and rode into their camp. He gave them a stark warning. He told them the route was scarcely passable, even for a man on a horse, let alone for wagons. He begged them not to try it. But James Reed, confident and perhaps a little arrogant, dismissed the warning. The allure of the shortcut was too strong. George Donner, who had been elected the group's captain, was an older, easygoing man and deferred to the forceful personality of Reed. And so in a decision that would seal their fate, about 20 wagons and 87 people broke from the main trail and turned their oxen toward the Hastings Cutoff. They arrived at Fort Bridger to find that Lansford Hastings was not there. He had already left with an earlier group, leaving behind instructions for others to follow. The first part of the cutoff led them into the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. The trail Hastings had promised was barely a trail at all. It was a tangled wilderness of dense brush and steep canyons. The pioneers were forced to become road builders, hacking their way forward, felling trees, and clearing boulders. Progress slowed to a crawl. Sometimes they made less than a mile and a half a day. It took them nearly a month to travel just 36 miles. The promised shortcut was already costing them precious time. Exhausted and demoralized, they finally emerged from the mountains and looked out upon the next obstacle, the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had assured them it was a 40-mile crossing that could be done in 2 days. He was disastrously wrong. The desert was more than 80 miles wide, a barren, waterless expanse of salt-crusted mud that baked under the relentless sun. The pioneers loaded up on water and grass for their animals and plunged in. The crossing was a catastrophe. The sun beat down, cracking the earth and the lips of the emigrants. The salt flats gave way to soft, deep mud that clung to the wagon wheels, making them nearly impossible to pull. Oxen, maddened by thirst, broke free and ran off into the desert to die. To lighten the loads, the families began to abandon their possessions. Tools, furniture, and keepsakes were left half buried in the salt. James Reed was forced to abandon 2 of his prized wagons. After 5 grueling days, the survivors staggered out of the desert. They had survived, but their spirits were broken, their livestock was decimated, and their food supplies were dangerously low. The Hastings cutoff, the shortcut that was supposed to save them a month, had cost them a month. And now, as they looked west, they knew that the most formidable obstacle of all still lay ahead. The towering peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Winter was coming. What would you do if you were in this situation? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like these. Thank you for watching. The ordeal in the desert had shattered the group's cohesion. What had held them together, the sense of community, the shared purpose, the bonds of love and family, all of it was gone, replaced by suspicion, resentment, fear, and desperation. Tempers flared. The first sign of this breakdown came in early October along the Humboldt River in Nevada. It was here that James Reed, one of the 3 Reeds in the party, got into a fight with a teamster named John Snyder. Their wagon teams had become entangled on a steep hill and harsh words were exchanged. According to Reed, Snyder threatened him and then struck him with his whip. When Snyder raised the whip for a second blow, Reed reacted. He pulled a hunting knife and plunged it into Snyder's chest. John Snyder was dead within minutes. It was a shocking act of violence. Some in the party wanted to hang Reed on the spot, but Reed had a wife and 4 young children. As a compromise, Reed was banished. He was forced to leave his family and his wagon behind and ride ahead alone, out of the camp. This was no easy task. To make sure Reed understood the gravity of his crime, the party confiscated his weapons, his extra clothing, and most of his food, leaving him with only the clothes on his back and a single blanket. His family was left to be cared for by the others, but they were now essentially orphans on the trail, their protector cast out into the wilderness. The social contract of the wagon train had been broken. The Donner Party pressed on toward the Sierra Nevadas, but the threat of starvation was now joined by another, the specter of death stalking the weary travelers. The remaining livestock grew weaker and weaker. The pioneers were forced to walk to spare the exhausted animals. An elderly Belgian man named Hardcoop was unable to keep up. He was last seen sitting by the side of the road, too weak to go on. He was left behind to die. The group had become too desperate to help its weakest members. In late October, they finally reached the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The ascent was brutal. The trail was steep and treacherous. But at the top of the pass lay the final descent into the sunny Sacramento Valley. They were so close. As they prepared for the final push, a light snow began to fall. It seemed like a minor inconvenience. They did not know it was the beginning of a monster storm, one of the earliest and heaviest in recorded history. On the last day of October, they made for the summit. But the snow was now 5 feet deep, a soft, impassable wall of white. They tried to force the wagons through but failed. Defeated, they retreated to a nearby lake to wait out the storm. The snow kept falling, 10 feet, 15 feet. It buried their wagons. It buried their cabins. It buried their hopes. The Donner Party was trapped. Over the next few weeks, the storm raged. Avalanches roared down the mountainside, crashing into the huddled wagons. Wind screamed through the canyons, whipping the snow into blinding swirls. The pioneers huddled inside their cabins, desperately trying to keep warm. Food was scarce. The cattle were too weak to move. There was nothing to hunt in the thick, whiteout conditions. All they had were the meager supplies they had brought with them, plus whatever they could salvage from their wrecked wagons. Then the cold began to seep into their bones. One by one, they succumbed to the freezing temperatures. At first it was the children. Then it was the old and the weak. Then it was anyone who ventured outside to relieve themselves or stretch their aching muscles. Before long, the only people tending the fire were the strong, the very young, and the very few who simply didn't know any better. They did not know that what they were doing, lighting that fire, was inviting death itself into the cabin. The fire needed wood. The wood had to be gathered outside in the biting cold. And each time someone went outside, there was a good chance they would not come back. The choice was stark. Freeze to death inside or freeze to death outside. By the time the snows finally melted and the survivors were found, only 48 of the original 87 pioneers were alive. Those who had survived the ordeal spoke of unspeakable horrors, of cannibalism, of desperate acts taken to stay alive just a little while longer. The story of the Donner Party is one of the darkest in American history, a cautionary tale of what can happen when a group of ordinary people are pushed to the edge. It's a story that continues to fascinate us today because in some ways it's still happening. Even now, even in our modern world, we still don't know how far we would go if we were put in those same desperate circumstances. We like to think we would do whatever it takes to survive, but we don't really know until we're tested. And when we are, we might find ourselves doing things we never thought possible. This is the host. And if you want to learn more about the Donner Party...
Hi, this is your host. This is part 4 of our series on the Donner Party. The first 3 parts are available on our site and on the app. In the last episode, we saw the pioneers reach the Truckee River and begin construction on their cabins, but there were problems. One of the major problems was that the river did not freeze over until late in the afternoon of December, forcing the pioneers to huddle around small fires while waist-deep in water trying to finish construction in the fast-approaching darkness. By the time the sun went down, only 1 cabin was complete. Meanwhile, the 2 Donner families had fallen several days behind. George Donner, Jacob's brother, had become ill. They stopped for the night on the bank of a stream called Alder Creek, about 18 miles below the larger group. Here they would spend a miserable Christmas, eating their last dry goods rations of hard bread and bacon. In the morning, they continued downstream where they found the rest of the party. But their hope for a Merry Christmas was dashed when they learned the entire stock of vegetables had spoiled during their absence and had to be thrown away. There was little left for them but their oxen, their beds, and their chairs. The next day, George Donner's health failed. He was too weak to continue on. He stayed in one of the cabins while the others went back up the river to look for a place where they could safely wait out the winter. They found a spot near the shore of a large lake and began work on additional cabins. This would become known as Donner Lake. Meanwhile, those at Alder Creek were struggling to keep alive. They were forced to abandon most of their food supplies on the trail. The remaining cattle were lost, buried and frozen in the ever-deepening snow. They were isolated, surrounded by a wilderness of white, with dwindling provisions and no prospect of escape. The days turned into weeks. The snow kept falling, reaching depths of 20 feet or more. The pioneers were forced to tunnel through the snow just to get from one cabin to another. The cold was relentless. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. They ate what they could, boiled strips of oxide, the tough material from their wagon roofs, into a foul, glue-like jelly. They ate charred bones, twigs, mice, and even their own leather shoes. Death came quickly. First, the weakest and the elderly succumbed to malnutrition and disease. Their bodies were wrapped in shrouds and buried in the deep snowbanks outside the cabins. Among the immigrants who survived the journey from Ireland was Patrick Breen. He kept a sparse but poignant diary that chronicles their descent into despair. His entries are a litany of suffering. Still snowing, snows all night. No fire. All the wood is under the snow. Our flour is done now. We are living on our beds and chairs. The children are gone to bed hungry. God damn this place. Provisions getting very scant. We have 5 or 6 days. Vitals left. Mrs. Reed here. No provisions. 14 days without a particle of bread. We are all living on broth and raw meat. Starkey died last night. He was delirious and talking all night. He went out to the lake in the morning. His feet were froze, and he could not walk. As November turned to December, the survivors realized that waiting for a spring thaw was not an option. They would all be dead by then. If anyone was to survive, they had to go for help. On December 16th, a party of 17 men, women, and children set out. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They carried meager rations for 6 days, hoping to reach a settlement in California which they believed was only 40 miles away. They were tragically mistaken. The journey would be over 100 miles, through some of the most rugged terrain in North America, in the dead of winter. Their ordeal would be the most horrific of all. Next time on the story of the Donner Party, the Forlorn Hope sets out across the snow-covered Sierra Nevada mountains in the dead of winter. Will they make it to safety, or will they perish in the unforgiving wilderness? Find out next time. This is the horrifying true story of the Donner Party. Part 5. The Last Resort. The Donner Party was a group of American pioneers who set out from Missouri in 1846 to travel to California, but they got lost in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and some resorted to cannibalism to survive. The Forlorn Hope, as the advance party was called, was led by Keseberg and his 2 Native American guides, Luis and Salvador. Their job was to find a pass through the mountains, but their supplies were low and they hadn't found a pass after 17 days. They were close to starvation. On December 12th, Keseberg made the decision to leave the others and try to find help on his own. He left behind Patrick Dolan and 2 sick women, noting in his journal that they would likely die. Just 3 days later, on December 15th, the entry reads, quote, "Patrick Dolan died this morning. We buried him immediately after preparing his body for burial. Mr. C cut off his nose and part of his thighs, and we all ate what we could. That same day, they lost a woman named Margaret, the wife of John Stark. She had asked to be left behind, so that she wouldn't be a burden to the group. Her emaciated body was left under a rock ledge, and then the following day, Keseberg wrote, quote, "We buried Sister Margaret this morning, having first cut off and dried some of her thighs and part of her calves. It was the only way they could preserve the meat." As they made their way through the mountains, the group suffered horribly from snow blindness and frostbite. Their eyes burned and their skin sloughed off their bodies. 5 more people died and were eaten before they finally stumbled into a Native American village on the western side of the Sierra. Only 7 of the original 17 members of the Forlorn Hope survived the ordeal. Meanwhile, back at the lake camps, the remaining pioneers were in desperate shape. There wasn't enough food or firewood to go around. People were dying at an accelerating rate. Those who were still alive dug up the bodies that had been buried in the snow and ate them. A diary entry from December reads, quote, "There is nothing but death and the eating of dead bodies going on here. Some have been crazy for several days, talking about eating children and grandchildren, which others are ready to do if it comes to that." A few days later, another entry reads, quote, "We bury our dead as fast as we can, but they dig them up and eat them. Some say it is better to eat a dead person than to let them be torn to pieces by the dogs or wolves, so they keep a watch by turns, day and night, to guard against the wolves, bears, and dogs. The whole camp is one vast body of open sores and running ulcers are everywhere. To make matters worse, there was a constant power struggle between the 2 camps, each led by a charismatic man named Reed, and the other by George Donner. Tensions came to a head when Reed tried to force George Donner's sick wife, Tamsin, to leave with the first rescue party. She refused, choosing to stay behind with her husband. On December 25th, 1846, just 4 weeks after the arrival of the first relief party, a total of 43 people remained alive at both camps. Of those, only 22 were able to walk. That afternoon, William Foster, one of the stronger survivors, set out with a man named Charles Stanton to find the rest of the relief party. Both men were carrying guns in case they needed to shoot any more of the sick or elderly to save the others. Just 2 hours into their trek, they came upon Luis and Salvador, the 2 Native American guides who had accompanied the Forlorn Hope. Both men were too weak to continue, and Salvador's feet were badly frostbitten. Foster believed they were a burden to the group, and without hesitation, he shot and killed them both. He then cut off their heads and distributed the meat among the other survivors. 33 days later, on January 26, 1847, Foster and the other survivors reached the nearest jailhouse. Staggering into the settlement, just as the Forlorn Hope had done before them, they were skeletal, frostbitten, and barely alive. 4 more would die on the way over the mountains. Only 9 of the original 22 walked away from the Donner camp alive. Over the next few days, rescuers returned to the lake camps to find only 6 more survivors, including Tamsin Donner. They were taken back to the jailhouse, but Tamsin died just 2 weeks later at the age of 38. She was the last member of the Donner Party to die. This has been the horrifying true story of the Donner Party. Part 5, The Last Resort. Do you find this story fascinating or terrifying? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to stay tuned for more historical tales, including more stories of the Donner Party. See you next time. Hey everyone. Part 4, The Long Winter. Just when things couldn't get worse for the Donner Party, they endured one of the worst winters in California's history. Temperatures plummeted, heavy snows blocked their path, and they were forced to abandon their wagons and live in makeshift cabins. The group split into two, with some choosing to stay by the Truckee River while others headed toward a lake further up the mountain. Both groups suffered horribly, enduring freezing temperatures, dwindling food supplies, and the agonizing decision to resort to cannibalism. The following spring, when rescuers finally reached the area, they discovered a horrifying scene. Mania diad. Their bodies left to decay in the snow. Those who survived were found in a state of utter despair, reduced to skin and bones. Miraculously, some lived to tell the tale, offering a first-hand account of the Donner Party's tragic fate. Now, before we dive into Part 7, if you're loving this series and want to support us in making more historical tales come to life, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Also, we would love to hear your thoughts on the series so far. What historical event or person do you want us to cover next? Drop your ideas in the comments below. Alright, let's continue the story. Part 7, Rescue and Reckoning. 4 separate rescue parties, known as reliefs, were organized and sent into the mountains between February and April of 1847. The rescuers were hardened mountain men, and even they were shocked by what they found. They discovered living skeletons huddled in filthy, dark cabins, the air thick with the stench of death. The snow was littered with human bones. They found pots containing human flesh and organs. The rescue was a harrowing process. The survivors were so weak, they had to be carried out. Some died on the journey back to safety. The third relief party arrived at the lake camp to find a gruesome scene. Only a handful of people were left alive. Among them a man named Louis Kess. He was found in a cabin surrounded by the dismembered bodies of his former companions. Rescuers accused him of murder, an accusation he denied for the rest of his life, though the dark cloud of suspicion never left him. The last person rescued from the mountains was Louis Kess. In late April, the final member of the party to be seen alive was Tamsin Donner. When the final relief party reached the Alder Creek camp, her husband's body was found carefully laid out and wrapped in a sheet, but Tamsin was gone. Her ultimate fate remains a mystery, though it is widely believed she was murdered by Kesseberg for her flesh and the money she was rumored to be carrying. Of the 87 people who took the Hastings cutoff, only 48 survived. The men had the highest mortality rate. The women and older children fared better, perhaps due to having more body fat and a greater will to survive for the sake of their families. Entire families were wiped out. The Donner brothers and their wives were all dead, but all 4 of James and Margaret Reed's children survived. The Reed family was reunited in California. They would forever bear the scars of their ordeal. The story of the Donner Party quickly became a national sensation, a gruesome tale of horror that captivated and repulsed the public. It became a byword for the perils of the West and a dark, cautionary tale about hubris and the thin veneer of civilization. But it is also, in its own tragic way, a story of survival. It is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human body and spirit, and a haunting reminder of the terrible choices people can make when they are pushed far beyond the limits of ordinary experience. The snows have long since melted from the Sierra Nevada, but the chilling story of those who were trapped there continues to echo through the canyons of American history. So there you have it, the terrifying ordeal of the Donner Party. If you enjoyed this series, be sure to check out our other videos, where we bring you the most spine-chilling tales from history. Thanks for watching. The ordeal in the mountains was over, but the suffering was not. For the 48 survivors of the Donner Party, rescue was not an end, but the beginning of a new and difficult chapter. They emerged from the Sierra Nevada not as triumphant pioneers, but as broken skeletal figures, haunted by what they had seen and done. They were brought to Sutter's Fort, in the heart of the Sacramento Valley, a bustling outpost that must have seemed like another world. The physical toll was staggering. Most were severely frostbitten, and many would lose fingers and toes. They were emaciated, weakened, and psychologically traumatized. The children, in particular, presented a heart-wrenching sight. The 7 surviving orphans of the Donner brothers were now destitute, having lost everything and everyone. Local communities and compassionate settlers rallied to their aid, offering food, shelter, and clothing. Families across California adopted the Donner orphans, giving them a chance at a new life, though one forever shadowed by their past. The Reed family was among the most fortunate. James Reed, who had been banished months earlier, had successfully made it to California, served in the Mexican-American War, and then became a key organizer of the rescue efforts. He was reunited with his wife, Margaret, and their 4 children, all of whom miraculously survived. The Reeds went on to become prominent and successful citizens of San Jose, California, embodying the very dream of prosperity that had led them west. Yet even they could not escape the ghosts of the trail. Their daughter, Irina Reed, who was 13 during the ordeal, wrote a powerful letter to her cousin shortly after being rescued. In it, she recounted their suffering in stark detail, but concluded with a line that speaks to their resilience. "We have all got through, and we are all well pleased with this country. ... Don't let this letter dishearten anybody. Never take no kutevs, and hurry along as fast as you can." For others, the trauma of the ordeal proved impossible to escape. Among them was Louis Kesselberg, who managed to survive the winter by eating human flesh, and then resorted to cannibalism when the mountain men arrived and killed off the remaining oxen. Kesselberg was the last survivor to be rescued, and he was found in the cabin with the dismembered corpses of Tamsin Donner and her 2 small children, along with parts of human flesh. Accusations immediately flew. Members of the Final Relief Party charged Kesselberg with murdering Tamsin Donner for her money, and with preferring human flesh to the cattle that had been left for him. Kesselberg was forced to defend himself against these accusations, both informally and in a slander lawsuit, which he later won. Though he was awarded only $1 in damages, the stigma never left him. He was ostracized for the rest of his life, a man publicly defined by the darkest chapter of his existence. He lived out his days as a pariah, a living embodiment of the horrors of the camps, forever denying the accusations of murder, but never able to escape the judgment of a horrified public. Of the 48 survivors, only a handful lived beyond the age of 50. The toll of the ordeal was simply too great. Now, a century and a half later, their story still haunts us, as it should, but there is something more to their tale. It is a story of ordinary people, not all of them very nice, thrust into an extraordinary situation, which they met with a mixture of courage, determination, desperation, and, yes, horrifying choices. The survivors were indeed rescuers, but they were also rescued. Theirs is a tale of human nature under extreme duress, but ultimately of human resilience, even in the face of the unimaginable. And in the end, that is perhaps why their story continues to resonate with us so powerfully. We are all, as Virginia Reed wisely wrote, well pleased with this country. But sometimes our past is never truly past. Sometimes our history comes back to haunt us, and sometimes, despite our best efforts, we find ourselves face to face with the ghosts of our own past. The legend of the Donner Party has endured for nearly 2 centuries, inspiring books, films, and countless articles. But what really set the story in stone was how it was received and retold after the survivors returned to civilization. Hello, and this is the first episode of our mini-series about the Donner Party. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon so you don't miss any of our new episodes. Now, let's jump into the story. News of the Donner Party's fate spread with astonishing speed. As the first skeletal survivors emerged from the mountains, their stories were seized upon by journalists and letter writers. The news traveled east via ship and overland mail, and soon newspapers across America and even in Europe were filled with lurid, often exaggerated accounts of the tragedy. The story had all the elements of a sensation. A perilous journey, a terrible mistake, and the ultimate taboo of cannibalism. Within a few weeks of the Reed and Storm families reaching California, accounts of their ordeal appeared in newspapers from San Francisco to New York. The most sensational of these came from a former sailor-turned-journalist named J. Ross Brown. Brown had accompanied the Reeds on the last leg of their journey out of the mountains, and though he didn't witness the cannibalistic acts firsthand, his imagination filled in the gaps. In an 1849 article for the New York Tribune, Brown wrote, when Mrs. Reed had exhausted every other means of preserving the lives of her children, she resorted to the awful alternative of letting them drink the blood of the slain. This image of a mother helplessly watching her children turn into monsters was one that stuck in the American consciousness and has never really left us. These early accounts often simplified a complex human tragedy into a gruesome morality play. The pioneers were portrayed either as heroic victims or as monstrous cannibals, with little room for nuance. The Hastings cutoff became the fatal flaw, a symbol of arrogant ambition, punished by a wrathful nature. Louis Kesselberg was universally cast as the villain, a ghoul who feasted on the dead, a convenient scapegoat onto whom the public could project its revulsion. As time passed, the story faded from the public consciousness, only to be revived periodically by sensationalist writers looking for a good yarn. Then, in the 1870s, a newspaper editor from Truckee, California, named Charles Fayette McGlasson, became fascinated with the story. McGlasson was a former hatter who had served in the Civil War before settling in Truckee, where he edited the local newspaper. He became intrigued by the Donner story when an elderly survivor named William Eddy moved to town and began publishing his own account. McGlasson tracked down and interviewed every living survivor he could find, including the Reed children, William Eddy, and the Breen family. He corresponded with them for years, painstakingly collecting their testimonies and cross-referencing their memories. After 5 years of research, McGlasson published his findings in an 1879 book, History of the Donner Party, A Tragedy of the Sierra. The book became the definitive account of the Donner Party for decades to come. McGlasson's work was invaluable. It preserved the first-hand accounts that would otherwise have been lost to time. However, he was also a man of his Victorian era. He sought to create a narrative that was not just factual, but also redemptive. In addition to interviewing survivors, McGlasson developed an almost obsessive interest in the story. He collected everything from personal letters to official government documents. He scoured old newspapers for mentions of the Donner Party, and he even traveled to Washington, D.C. to examine the case files. He wanted to create a definitive history of the event, something that would put to rest many of the rumors and misconceptions that had grown up around the story. And yet, there are moments throughout McGlasson's text where we can feel his desire to shape the story in order to fit his own moral vision. He emphasized the heroism of the rescuers and the stoicism of the female survivors, while often downplaying the most gruesome details or framing them as a noble sacrifice for the sake of the children. He, too, portrayed Kesselberg as a deeply sinister figure. McGlasson's narrative became the dominant retelling of the Donner Party for more than a century, and it continues to influence modern tellings of the tale. Though some historians have challenged McGlasson's interpretation, his work remains an important resource for anyone wanting to understand how the legend of the Donner Party captured the American imagination. In our next episode, we'll be discussing the role that the Donner Party played in shaping California's identity. So make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.